Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm your host, coming to you from Athens. Again, I'm going to try to keep the podcast going through the first part of the summer. I've got some more episodes lined up now. People's schedules change and, may have to be flexible in posting them before I take my late summer, early fall break, which I've done almost every year, I think. I have some news from the publishing front. My book on the survey of Western understandings of the Eastern Empire from late antiquity to the 20th century is now scheduled for publication next year with the University of Chicago Press with the very interesting title, Phantom Byzantium, Europe, Empire, and Identity from Late Antiquity to World War II. And I am currently working on finishing up the book on 1453, the Siege and Fall of Constantinople, when I have time. So we'll see when that is scheduled to appear. And while I'm making announcements, I actually hadn't planned this, but I sat down at the microphone and this all came out. I wanted to share with you an online list of ancient history podcasts that was sent to me by the people at a company, I guess, called Million Podcasts. So if you search for Million Podcasts and top 90 ancient history podcasts, you will find a list of ancient history podcasts. If you're listening to this one, which is on the list, you might actually find some of the other ones to be intriguing as well. So you can go look them up there. And now that I'm looking at their message, apparently they also have a list of top 50 medieval history podcasts and top 40 Roman history podcasts. And this one is on both of them. So, yay. Okay, enough about that. It is conventionally understood that Greek, in contrast to Latin, did not over time produce many offspring languages. Right? So we all know that Latin gave rise to all of the Romance languages, which are scattered across mostly Western, but in some cases Eastern Europe as well. Whereas Greek, well, there's only really ever been one Greek language at a time. And when you look at the branch of the genealogical charts of languages and their descendants, there's just this one line going from ancient Greek to modern Greek. And broadly speaking, that's certainly true, though inevitably we run into the problem of how you define a language and how you define a dialect. However, there are some pretty big caveats that we have to put into that picture, which is that we are so dependent on the written record, and the written record is in many ways, especially during the Middle Ages, so conservative in the register of the language that it uses, that we can't reasonably say that we are informed about all of the different ways in which people spoke Greek from Sicily and southern Italy to the Pontus or, upper Mesopotamia. There is quite possibly a great deal of variation that we can't see, and in particular can't hear. Moreover, the modern Greek language was, as it were, cleaned up, kind of purged and purified during the 19th century when it was kind of recast as a official language of a new nation state, has tended to create a kind of normative standard against which variants are assessed and interpreted. So for a long time on many islands, or if you go into the interior, you will find versions of Greek being spoken that, seem to or sound quite different in many ways from standard, Athenian nightly news kind of Greek. But these are never taken to represent a separate branch of the language, almost verging on being a different Greek language. Moreover, during the 19th and 20th centuries, the speakers of those, let's call them dialects, were heavily influenced by the educational, informational apparatus of the modern Greek state, which reached out to them as kind of Greek communities abroad if they were not in the Greek state or within its territories. and which, for better or for worse, nudged them toward conformity with the national standard. And this was facilitated by two vectors of interaction, one of which was the Greek Orthodox Church, the assumption that these Greek speakers are kind of by definition Orthodox, and so are integrated into the church structures, and the second being the national Greek identity and the kind of ideology that accompanies it. But now let's suppose, hypothetically, there were a group of Greek speakers who were not Orthodox Christians or Christians at all, and so were not brought into the fold, as it were, of the church and its educational institutions, and also did not self-identify as Greek nationals, and so were also not recipients or were not exposed to the national story, which has its own kind of linguistic consequences. And there is precisely such a group of Greek speakers in the Pontus, so this is in northeastern modern Turkey, who have been studied for years by my guest today. Ioanna Sitaridou is a professor of Spanish and historical linguistics at the University of Cambridge, and she works also on Portuguese and its presence throughout the world. And we're not going to be talking about that today because what she does in her spare time is study a Greek language that still survives in northeastern Turkey, which she studies under the name Romeika. Now, this is interesting because, completely independently of her work before I knew who she was, I have done research on the names of the Greek language that were used in the medieval period, and I found evidence that at least spoken Greek was being called across the East Roman polity Romeika, starting at least in the 11th century, possibly earlier, and certainly down to the 19th century. So spoken Greek, so vernacular spoken Greek, was called Romeika, and I was very intrigued that she would be using this term, which is in fact the term that is used by the speakers of this language, because they and their linguistic ancestors have used it for at least 1,000 years. It is a version of Greek that differs in some of its basic grammar from the standard modern Greek, but is also clearly a descendant of various earlier forms of the language that were spoken in that region before the Ottoman Empire in the imperial period. And so there's a remarkable convergence of interests here from very different source material and approaches, but so fortuitously she came to give a talk at Chicago, and I went, and then we spoke, and we found so many points of contact that I hope we continue this conversation. But I thought that parts of it were interesting enough to share with all of you, not only because of the very unexpected light that it shows onto the language that people were speaking in this part of the world and have been for a very long time, but also with the very carefully methodical and conscientious way in which Ioanna has approached her fieldwork among these people who are situated at such a complicated nexus of sort of states, languages, religions, and ideologies, where academic research has to be very self-conscious and principled in order not to negatively impact the people it's studying, but also not to distort the materials that it is studying, and to bring it to the world's attention in the best way possible. And I have to say I remain deeply impressed by Ioanna's commitment to these principles, as you will see from our discussion. So I will stop there. Thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Again, check out the Ancient History podcasts on Million Podcast site, and in case you want to find some others to fill up some summer hours. Without any further delay, here's my conversation with Ioanna Sitaridou. Ioanna, thank you for coming on to the podcast, and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Anthony.
Can you tell us a little bit about the landscape of the villages where this language is spoken first, just to kind of set the scene, because I've noticed that you are particularly attracted to the terrain and just the physical environment that you spend so much time in, and you like to show photographs of it, and some parts of it really spectacular. So what does this look like, and what does it mean to you?
The landscape is significant in many ways, not to mention, as you said, drop-dead gorges. The landscape is rugged with high mountains, which rise steeply from the Black Sea coast. In the Chaikara region specifically, especially near Uzungöl, one of its most famous villages, and a very touristy place these days, the surrounding peaks typically reach altitudes of 2,000 to 3,300 meters, which is something like 6,500 to 10,000
Hmm.
feet. The area was historically isolated and road access was not easy until recently. This has led to the preservation of these varieties essentially because they were cut off. Moreover, the dense forests, the rivers, the waterfalls, the lakes, and the pastures, which the locals call parhare or yailades, and this is where people go in the summer with their flocks, creating an entire socioeconomic system, which is essentially a subsistence-oriented economy, practicing transhumance and small-scale agriculture, including beekeeping and cultivating corn, collard greens, and beans. Language-wise, it means that they have specialized words to capture this range of activities.
Hmm.
So if you understand these words, you must understand the lifestyle, and hopefully the photographs help bringing it to others. Also, on a more psycho-emotional level, the high mountains symbolize both freedom and the lack of it. Freedom because people are free within their communities, as well as being cut off at the same time from others. So this duality characterizes the Romeika psyche, I think.
It's a very interesting point that you make about the activities and the vocabulary that's linked to them, because when I was reading the samples of the language that you included in various, they were referring to activities that I don't think I would have the vocabulary for even in like English. And so that made it even more difficult for me to, all the different stages of beekeeping or not. Um, Beyond that, um, how hard or easy is it for speakers of like standard Athenian modern Greek to understand this language?
Uh, This is a difficult question to answer because we cannot accurately measure the grammatical distance between Romeyka on the one hand and Standard Athenian on the other. In fact, we linguists are still searching the most accurate way to measure grammatical distance between languages which are close cognates and
Hmm.
languages in general. It also depends on the speaker, how much exposure they have of non-standard varieties, their level of education, their degree of familiarity with agricultural tasks, for instance. Overall, there is little mutual comprehension between the two, although there is a great, almost perfect comprehension between Pontic Greek speakers and Romeyka speakers.
I see. Right. Okay, so let's cut to an audio file here of you reading some of this language, just so that our audience can get a sense of it. If they speak Greek, they try to see how much of it they can pick out, and we'll return right after that.
Θείο, θεία, αυλά, δε φτάς. Εγώ Ιωάννα ακούω. Μοχαλήμενα σ' ονιβερσιτέζι είμαι. Η παλαιήμουνα ας στο Γιουμσχανέ έστεκαν, χάρ στο Γιουνανιστάν, άμα εγώ ας στην Ιγγιλτέρα στέκω. Πολλά γλώσσα συντυχαίνω, άμα πολλά αγαπώ Ρωμαίκα να συντυχαίνω. Ένα θεία είπε με, ούλε τα γλώσσες μάθα, από τζεκά πας τη γλώσσα ας εξέρισα. Α έτσι πήγα. Εσύ? Ίνσαλα ανελέπωσε στην Ισταμπόλη.
So you've argued that this language preserves some very archaic or ancient grammatical features, and you focus a lot on the matter of the infinitive. Briefly speaking, what is an infinitive and why is it so important for your research?
The infinitive is a non-finite verbal form that is the basic form of the verb, which is not inflected for person number agreement with a subject, but instead it has to bind to a particular subject. So for instance, let's consider an example. We can eat and drink a lot and be well dressed, but we cannot restrain and be humble. In this example, we understand that those who eat, drink, etc., are we, which both formally and notionally serves as the subject of can. In modern Greek, the infinitives have been replaced by another construction, which we call the na clauses. To start with, my fixation with the Romeyka infinitive goes back to my PhD thesis, in which I analyzed a specific type of a Romance infinitive, little understood until that time. So long before I started analyzing the Romeyka infinitive, I had already significant expertise in the synchronic and diachronic syntax of the infinitives. Now, why is the Romeyka infinitive so central to my work? First, it allows us to chronologize some of the changes and thus shed light to the evolution of Asia Minor Greek. We know quite a bit about how the infinitive got lost in other Greek varieties, including Standard Modern Greek, which means we can use this information to chronologize its survival in Romeika. I argued that the infinitive can be dated back to Hellenistic times, since it enjoys a productive infinitival huge in before clauses, which became obsolete by early medieval times in all other Greek varieties. Another reason has to do with the fact that the infinitive in Romeika allows us to tell the unusual tale of how reanalysis can lead to preservation, when most times we associate change with loss. And finally, because it allows us to assess the impact of ideology in the way we explain the history of a language. The Greek infinitive, as I have argued, it became nationalized. In other words, it became a proof of historical continuity with deniers and supporters, and the Romeyka infinitive essentially being a true disruptor to all existing camps.
Oh, what do you mean by that? A disruptor to what are the camps and how does its existence in Romeika disrupt them?
So when you essentially make the infinitive a marker of a continuous Greek presence, it means that if you find the infinitive, then you have proof of this presence. If you don't find it, it means that you don't have proof of this of the continuity.
Right.
So for speakers of standard Athenian, as you said, the fact that you have the infinitive surviving in Muslim populations is a bit of an anathema. It shouldn't
Right.
happen, really. So it kind of spoils the prototypical viewing of identity in nationalist terms.
Right.
From the perspective, obviously, of Turkish ideology, it is also problematic because it shows that there's Greek-speaking presence in the area for a very long time. So since Falmerayer, pretty much, the infinitive has actually acquired this additional dimension of being an identity token. And the Romeika infinitive actually somehow manages to distress everybody, which is probably a good thing.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. It's probably best if it does, if it's going to offend, it should offend everybody in some way or another. Um, so just to give the audience a sense of the timeline, so the infinitive as a as a distinct kind of grammatical construction in Greek is probably fades out of the spoken language before, let's say, certainly before 1000 AD, right? But it continues in this version of the language for another 1,000 years. And that's extremely significant, I mean, linguistically and fascinating,
That's right.
right?
And the gradual, I mean, the loss is actually gradual. So at different chronological phases, we capture different distributions.
Right,
So in
right,
my work, I studied the distribution of the infinitive throughout the history of Greek to the best of
yeah,
to the
yeah.
best of my abilities at the time, and the best to the best of the information available at the time. And I actually saw that the Romeyka infinitive could not have been reanalyzed to what it is today if it weren't for a previous layer, namely the Hellenistic. Otherwise, we cannot explain its distribution today. The medieval Greek distribution of infinitive is not enough to account for how it functions today.
Right. Okay. I had similar thoughts regarding the practice of bull sacrifices. It's
That's fascinating.
yes, yes, because they're still done on my island. And in many, many respects, they look very similar to ancient ones, and yet they're not an antiquarian revival. They're attested during the Ottoman period when no one would have any kind of incentive to recreate a pagan bull sacrifice. And there's a lot of evidence from late antiquity that some of these things were repackaged as sort of Christian, community events and carried on. Anyway, okay, that's different. So, can you tell us some of the historical factors that contributed to this language preserving these kinds of archaic features, not going in the direction of standard modern Greek for the most part? So, why is it so archaic?
In a nutshell, I would say isolation and oblivion. Um, Let me just explain isolation to start with. Pontus remained relatively stable in the margins of the Byzantine Empire between the 4th and the 10th centuries. During this period, contact with Constantinople was in a leapfrog manner. That is, it was interrupted, not continuous.
Mm,
Greek in Pontus was undoubtedly given some boost by the dissolution of Byzantine rule in Constantinople due to the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and the move of some of the members of the Byzantine imperial family to Trebizond. However, once Trebizond fell to the Ottomans in 1, subsequent Islamizations have created further disruption. From this point onwards, the Islamized communities became isolated from the Christian ones, and as a result maintained more archaic features. Meanwhile, the Christian ones continue to be in contact with Constantinople, mediated by the monasteries in the region, for instance. And in fact, from the 18th century onwards, education is burgeoning, which means further contact with modern Greek. Now, since the exchange of populations in 1923 and the consequent trauma, saw Romeika becoming a disruptor to the emerging national ideologies of Greece and Turkey, which forced essentially Romeika into a corner.
mm.
Interestingly, this act of oblivion essentially secularized Romeika, otherwise it may have become extinct much earlier.
Right. Um, yes. So in many national ideologies, for them to work with a population, a language, a custom, whatever, everything has to be aligned properly. The language, religion, and narrative and history, they all have to align because otherwise the template just can't work with them. And it seems that this doesn't align with either of them perfectly. I can easily imagine that there were even in the period of the Empire of Trebizond, so roughly 1200 to 1461, that different kinds of Greek were spoken in Trebizond itself versus the mountain communities that you study. I mean, even then, I imagine. But this is one of the interesting paradoxes that Islamization has a result of preserving older forms of Greek, which is, again, from a national narrative standpoint, it's sort of paradoxical and perhaps sort of impossible. Anyway, so let's get to that. Can you tell us about the profile of the people who speak this language today, just in terms of like nationality, religion, other languages? Who are these people?
Romeika speakers are Turkish, they are Muslims, and they speak Turkish. Very few speak some English, and very few speak some Greek. They also have a more nuanced sense of identity as being Turkish plus or Turkish X,
Mm,
the fact that they also speak Romeika. The people in the villages belong to the lower socioeconomic classes, given their occupation with agriculture and farming. But in the big urban centers in Istanbul and Ankara, they can be found to occupy the higher echelons as well.
right. So I don't know this about Turkey. For example, in the US, there's what's called sort of white ethnics. It's a category. So these are people who would be, at this point, white, but have a kind of, Italian or Greek or Jewish. This is the plus that you mentioned. I don't know if Turkish national identity has this kind of. I mean, I know that there are people who are that, right? They're Turkish plus this or Georgian or something. I don't know if that's, however, a sort of commonly recognized category, the sort of, I don't know, ethnic or language inflected Turkish person. Um, has that come up in your research? Is there a space for this group to occupy comfortably in the kind of constellation of Turkish identity?
Look, the question is I mean, it's a very important one, obviously, and constantly in the making, so to speak. It all
Yeah.
depends how speakers position themselves. I think and if I reflect this correctly, and I mean, we have to stress that this is actually how I interpret things. And, I may be wrong in some ways. What I see is what I just said, namely that they are Turkish, they are Muslims, they speak Turkish, but they also speak Romeika, which they value very much. And that also gives them some sort of additional dimension in their identity, not something that they can necessarily capture in words, and all the more not something that they can assign a label. Now,
Hmm.
we have labels, okay, in our cultures, they don't. Okay, so that is something also which is very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and even in the US, of course, that label has gone from being a social disadvantage to at times being an advantage, um, or a kind of identity, perk that people will actively broadcast. Anyway, let's not, that would take us into the history of Turkey and away from this group. Another quick question: is there anyone left today who speaks only Romeika?
No, all Romeyka speakers are bilinguals, although for many of the older generation, Turkish is clearly the second language. So essentially, they picked up Romeyka as a first language. And then when they had to go to school, they started learning Turkish.
Okay. In cases where they emigrate, let's say you have a couple, they speak Romeika, they emigrate, I don't know, Canada or the United States or whatever. And I don't know if you studied the diaspora, as it were. What language do they teach their children?
So this is again a very interesting question. I'll just only change something in the way you asked the question. The diaspora is to be found in Germany, the Netherlands, France, and Sweden, and Belgium, perhaps.
Hmm.
Uh, so no, they don't pass on Romeika, but most of the younger generations they have a very vivid memory of their parents speaking this language, usually as a crypto language.
Right.
The one
Okay.
that wanted to tell a secret or say something and keep it a secret from the children that will use Romeika.
Okay. So many in our audience will wonder, how is it that speaking Greek survived in this corner of Turkey? Weren't all the Greeks sent to Greece after the war, the exchange of populations, 1923?
So, as we've mentioned, the fall of Trebizond in 1461 to the Ottomans saw the city becoming majority Muslim a century later. The capture of Trebizond must have led many Greeks inland, for instance, to Chaldea, the area roughly covering modern-day Gümüşhane. Extensive Islamization of Greek speakers in Of, Sürmene, Rize, and Matsuka is reported to have happened in the 16th and 17th centuries. Intriguingly, though, while conversion to Islam across Asia Minor has conventionally been accompanied by a linguistic shift to Turkish, communities in the valleys have retained Romeika to this day. The degree of contact between Christian and Muslim speakers of Greek in Pontus from Islamization to the beginning of the 19th century remains a controversial topic, although most certainly it was limited. Now, with religion as the only criterion for the Greco-Turkish population exchange in 1923, which is known as the Lausanne Treaty. Greek-speaking Christians of Pontus were forced to leave Turkey and relocate to Greece, and from there also to the US, where there is a substantial community of Pontic Greek speakers. Australia, same. Germany, while Romeika-speaking Muslim communities in the Trabzon area remained in their homeland as they professed Islam, explaining why this Greek variety is still spoken in small enclaves in the region.
Right.
It's now 1923, and till very recently, the two speech communities were oblivious of each other's existence.
Wow. And the one is what we call Pontic Greek has been always in contact with the church, the Orthodox Church, and subsequently the modern Greek state, right? And its sort of educational, pedagogical, ideological outreach to them, and so they gravitated more toward that, whereas this community did not,
Precisely.
right? So do members of this community tell a narrative about how it is that they speak this language? Like, how do they situate themselves in history? If I mean, maybe there isn't a dominant narrative. Maybe you've heard many of them, but like, if there is a dominant one, what's that? Otherwise, like, is there one that you came across that you thought was interesting?
I don't think there's a dominant idea as to how they came to speak Romeyka. And of course, the sort of picture I captured when I first went there, which was 16 years ago, and what speakers think today has changed dramatically because these days everyone has a mobile, and
Mm,
internet. So it's a very different story. But when I first arrived in the region, there were different sort of explanations. Like some actually thought that they were just speaking a Turkish dialect. Okay, others would say well, that we speak actually Greek. Others would just say, well, we speak this language is Laz. So there would be
mm.
confusion either with a Turkish dialect or a Laz, which is a Georgian type of language. And essentially, a lot of confusion, not really knowing how to position their language in the broader narrative.
So who came up with the term Romeika to label it? How did that come about?
So to start with, let me just clarify. Romeika is the term speakers themselves use to refer to their language. Now, in the literature, another term is used, namely Pontic Greek, for the same varieties I document, but I prefer to use the term Romeika, which is what the majority of speakers themselves use to refer to their language. Some
Mm,
speakers also use Romeika or even Rumaika, but Romeika is definitely the dominant one.
mm,
The same speakers may also refer to their variety as a Rumca when they speak in Turkish, and therefore for me this is also a perfectly acceptable term. It would be outside current academic practice, or perhaps I should say outside my academic practice, to use a term that speakers themselves do not identify with. Now, as you of all people know very well the complications with labels and glossonyms, the term Romeika was commonly used to refer to vernacular modern Greek until the 20th century. And as such, the term does not adequately distinguish between Romeyka and Pontus today and Greek varieties spoken in other areas around the Black Sea, for instance, in Sokkum, in Mariupol, or in Istanbul, all of which are also known as Romeyka. Now, when there is a further need for me to specify which variety of Romeyka we're discussing, then I add the toponym. So I say Romeyka of Tonya, Romeyka of Chaikara, Romeyka of Sürmene. I mean, names we know it's a complicated business, and
hmm.
not be kind of a perfect term. But in early days, I had huge disputes with some very well-known sociolinguists actually about how I should be calling this variety. But I stood firmly. I refused to call it anything other than what the speakers themselves call it.
That is so interesting to some experiences that I've had. And also for the language, which, as you know, we can trace back to something like the 11th century, if not earlier, for referring to sort of spoken Greek. And it continues down to the, well, 19th century, even in like mainland Greece and places like that, when the term Greek becomes dominant, or Hellenic or whatever, with the modern nation state. And you're right that, I mean, what you seem to be doing is using the term in a sort of narrow technical sense for this particular language, while recognizing that there are broader senses that one might encounter in the literature, but not used in this very specific sense. And I have the same issue in describing, you know, what most people will call the Byzantine Empire or Byzantium, which has its own name, Romania, which is from like around 300. And I have the same issue. Sometimes people will tell me, well, it will be too confusing because there is a Romania country. And I'm like, yeah, those are genealogically related names. But I don't think that we can strip one whole historical society of its name just for that. We just have to learn to live with the kind of ambiguity and complexity.
That
You
that
know,
was my reaction
yeah,
to these disputes, actually, because these social linguists were, and others actually were, didn't like the fact that I was using this name. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are two issues here. What sort of name should you use to refer to this language? And I cannot use a name which alienates the speakers. I mean, the speakers have all sorts of issues. Why should I add to their problems? I mean, why should I kind of call it a
yes,
language something that they don't call it themselves?
yes,
But technically, when I do my historical reconstruction, and I mean, I define things very carefully, so there is no room for any sort of ambiguity. So to be honest, I don't see what is the issue. But what is the issue? And you have definitely argued very convincingly about that in your own work. I mean, it's heavily ideological.
exactly, because any other name that you use has a narrative. It can't not. I don't know, even unless you were to use some code number, XZ157 or whatever. Like, I don't know. But we're not doing that for anybody else. So that also conveys a sense that there's something very strange going on here when it's not. And those narratives just work their way into every discussion subsequently because people just can't not assume essences exist where names exist. It's just, anyway, the funny thing is, on the side of the state name issue, it wouldn't be such a problem if Western classicists could not pronounce Greek using Latin rules. If they could just not do that. But I don't know if you know this, but certainly in America, students who are taught ancient Greek are taught to accentuate it using Latin rules. So that they're almost like physiologically unable to say Romania. They have to say Romania. It drives me mad. Anyway, though I don't know of any other language that is taught where you're told to use the rules of a different language.
It's very simple to say the least. But
Yeah.
look, when it comes to language, language has always been a kind of an almost perfect vehicle for somebody to sell their own narrative,
Yeah.
essentially impose their own sort of ideological schema on others. It has been Language has been weaponized to make people feel bad about themselves, to make them do what you want to do. Language has always been used as an instrument of something. So
Mm.
it's really surprising.
Yeah.
I mean, it is very sad, uh, and
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that we have to accept it, obviously.
All right. So let me ask you the hardest question that I'm going to ask you today. Dialect or language?
So, yes, it's probably not a fair question to ask. I will say language, but then I'm going to cheat by saying that I mean, we would need several podcasts to analyze this.
Okay.
So let's save it for another time. Suffice to say that the distinction between language and dialect is deeply sociopolitical and heavily, again, ideologized. So for me, Romeika is a Greek language.
Okay. So we had this conversation before, and so let me try to interpret in a nutshell what the problem might be, and that is that from if you were to look at the problem from a strictly linguistic standpoint and were able to treat all versions of a language sort of equally, then you might be comfortable calling it treating it as a dialect. But because that designation is very often used to create hierarchies and create narratives that are false to the people and the language that you're talking about, it's a problematic term for that reason, right? Like so there's this kind of split between the linguistics and the politics that invest these terms, right?
Yes. So you're absolutely right. Let me just kind of try to expand a little bit. As I said, we probably cannot afford to go into a full discussion on.
Yeah, yeah.
But the main idea is, or the majority idea in the literature, was that you have different ancient Greek dialects that they become a Hellenistic Greek koine. And this koine becomes a medieval Greek variety, and then it splits into modern Greek dialects. So they would count Pontic Greek and Romeika as a modern Greek dialect. So I'm not sure if this viewing of things is actually the right one. And definitely for the Pontic branch, to which Romeika belongs, I argued that this cannot capture many of the syntactic phenomena that we find, that we need to assume an earlier layer. So perhaps there are varieties that emerged in medieval times and they are modern Greek dialects, but Romeika doesn't seem to be one of them.
Okay, so it wouldn't be easy to put into the genealogical tree, as it were. It's a bit too complex. Yeah.
You just have to revise it.
Right,
But
right.
you revise genealogical trees, I mean, you have to
Yes,
undo
yes.
ideology. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't have, yeah, that's what I do for a living,
right.
but people don't like that very much
No,
because
they
they
get used to it.
way of viewing things. Yeah.
Um, okay, let's talk a little bit about your experience with these people and just the conditions of your field work. So how do you embed yourself in these communities in order to do research? How do you win their trust?
I will first address the latter because it is of paramount importance to me. There's no technique, method, trick, or ruse to win their trust. Trust is simply not won this way. And whatever you think you gain this way is definitely not trust, probably your perception of them trusting you. Trust is won when it is mutual, honest, and tested in terms of words and actions through time. When people present themselves to each other in their true as possible guise, as authentically as possible. When you explain in full detail what you're doing, who you are, why you think it is important, when you share your notes and aspects of your life, when you ask their opinions and you take them into account as well as their needs. Anthropologists may disagree with that to some extent, at least, namely about how authentic you can be in the field. But
Hmm.
I wouldn't have been able to have a fieldwork persona and a real life persona, and these being very different. So as to how I embed myself, I find some local contact and I stay with their family or a family they recommend, preferably a household where men come and go or they're not there. Uh, and once I stay with a family, obviously lots of people come and see me. We go to other people's houses in the evenings for the so-called muhabbet. And that's how I get to learn and talk to many people, basically.
But you're still following some kind of research protocols. In other words, there are many circumstances in which you have to actively decide that you're an observer rather than a participant. Are there things that, if you were just a non academic embedded in this community, just kind of living your life there, that you might have done maybe to help them out in certain ways or to do or say certain things that you shouldn't as a scholar studying their language? Like, are there certain lines that you're careful not to cross? I'm just asking for some examples. I mean, not a whole manual for field work, but
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I haven't thought about this before, but in my case, I don't think so. It is possible, of course, that the person and the scholar has fused into one, but I didn't come across a situation where, I came across situations where I had to take quick decisions, but never situations where I thought that myself will do X and the scholar needs to do something else.
okay. Because in part, it's because you're studying their language. As you said, I mean, you're not an anthropologist as such, so you're not like trying to observe a community and not interfere with it through your presence. You're studying their language, and language is an adaptive sort of mechanism too. I mean, their language is adapting to your presence.
Mhm.
Um,
Look, of course, the language adapts to my presence, there's no doubt. But because I do monolingual data collections, which means that I use Romeika to collect my,
hmm. uh,
I think we have, there is some interference of my sort of presence because I'm not from the village, but not as much as we would have had under other circumstances if, for instance, I was using Turkish or some other language to collect data. Also, I suppose, I'm not from the village, but they know that my great-grandfathers came from the area. So I tell them that, and I tell them the precise villages and all that. So they know that I'm not exactly, I'm not exactly a foreigner. An alien, non-alien, so to speak.
Right. Do you have your own dictionary of this language?
No, no, there was no dictionary, but actually these days there is a dictionary which has been authored by a native of this area. I
Okay.
don't use it because I don't need it, but it's actually a very good piece of work.
Wait, so you weren't like you didn't have a little notebook where you were keeping down lists of words and you just learned them? I mean, that's incredible.
I do keep notes. I have a notebook all the time with me because they will always say something amazing that I need
Right,
to
right.
note down. And of course, I have my the recorder. But yeah, I do make lists of words depending on. Usually, I'm much more interested in the grammar. But
That's
I'm
such a linguist.
Yeah, I'm not going for the vocabulary, but because you see, there's much more. If we lose some bits of the grammar, you cannot do reconstruction.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
I'm in a constant anxiety state that I'm losing my native speakers of a certain age, and that means I won't be able to go as far as I could. So
yeah.
yes,
Okay.
I'll go for the grammar.
So do they ask you awkward questions about their identity that you prefer not to answer? Because like you can't give them the true answer here, right? But I'm sure that they must have asked you, what do you think about like who we are, things like this. And how do you answer those?
So they haven't asked me awkward questions, although I'm not sure what would count as awkward. They do ask me whether I'm married and whether I've got children or not, but I do not find these questions
No,
awkward.
sure.
Culturally perfectly accepted within, for the sort of community. Um, a question that I did get once, but it was particularly marking. I have been asked this question before, but once during a feast with a very mystical atmosphere with lots of music and dancing, in an amazing location with a big fire, a group of men riddled by existential angst. You could see this on their painted on their face. Asked me the question, "Who are we, Ioanna?" And I remember how I felt. I choked up and managed to say, what you are is probably what I am. And I'm still trying to make sense of that. So we can imagine how one may have grabbed this emotionally charged opportunity to manipulate speakers
Hmm.
by suggesting a heavily ideologized identity position on them.
All right. Right.
So that was, if you like, not exactly awkward, but it was. it was a difficult one to manage. It's a very simple question, but it's such an impossible answer.
Yes, and the 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 truest answer, in a sense, that you could give is not a particularly helpful one, which is, well, I can tell you about your language, which which is not
Exactly.
what they're asking, really.
And that was the second sort of thing. Then I can
Yes.
ask, look, I don't know about language,
Well,
but I can say I can tell you about the language, which is all I can do, to be honest.
yes, let me tell you about the history of the infinitive. All right. So, um, realistically speaking, what are the prospects for this language's survival over the next couple of generations? I mean, as all very small languages, it's probably under threat and possibly contracting. Is this is there like a rate of contraction that we can gauge? What are its prospects?
The prospects are not looking good. I fear the language is becoming severely endangered at an astonishing speed. I mean, first to start with, it was the TV, and now mobiles and the amelioration of roads. Um, since I started going there 16 years ago, the roads have been transformed, which is, of course, a wonderful thing because people need infrastructure, and there has been all this investment in infrastructure, which is a super positive thing. But of course, that meant that once the isolation is relaxed, the language becomes much more endangered. And here there's also an interesting oxymoron. While more and more people are becoming aware of Romeika, and they consider its survival of great importance, fewer native speakers emerge.
Hmm.
So you would have expected
Mm.
that with the rise of awareness, the parents will pass on the language to the children. But although for sure that means a positive stance towards the language, it doesn't bias what is needed. And what is needed for every endangered language is native speakers, parents speaking the language to their kids.
Right. So they're presumably aware of this sort of imminent or ongoing crisis in the transmission of the language. What are their attitudes about it?
Their attitudes are they're very sensitized. I mean, they don't want this to happen. The question is, how much can they do to undo it? And I have to state here I have to state two concerns that I have. One is that at the moment, the situation in Turkey, as pretty much, I mean, I suppose as in many places in the world, is very complicated. Financially, people have bigger worries than that. And the second problem is that the parents' generation right now are not the native speakers of the language themselves,
Mm.
which means that it's not so natural for them to pass it on. So they want to do it, but in a way, it's a little bit late.
This kind of language policy, a language policy that would be successful in reversing these kinds of trends is a very, very difficult thing that requires enormous resources and sort of state investment. And when you look at, and I suppose these kinds of policies would have started in the 19th century in various places. When schools are being set up across Europe and decisions were being made about the languages that were taught in schools and so on. It's a very, very difficult question and requires incredible resources. And this is a language that, has come sort of late to the game of that, to the challenge of institutional support.
Mm.
And I imagine that presumably on the, let's say, broadly Greek side, there might be some interest in that, but it also comes with its own kind of pitfalls and dangers, right? So, and in other words, I can imagine people who are like genuinely, sincerely willing to help provide institutional support for this language, but who, in doing so, might sometimes cause harm or do it in a clumsy way or whatever. Like, what are the kinds of problems that I mean, just as a linguist or historian of languages, that states or institutions can cause to a language in this situation if they try to intervene?
And Personally, I wouldn't trust any Greek institution to offer any support to an endangered Greek language. Look what has happened in southern Italy. Essentially, they started supporting Greco, and the support they offered were courses of modern Greek. There are no speakers of Greco left. They're all heritage speakers, and they all try to learn modern Greek. No, I wouldn't trust any Greek institution, I'm sorry to say, to offer any kind of support. And of course, in this context, it wouldn't have been welcomed, and very understandably so. Look, language policy is a huge topic, and there's no doubt that it is the sort of thing that requires both resources and what ultimately gives a lot of prestige to a given language. However, to be more realistic, the question is, what do you do in the absence of this sort of support, and namely in favorable language policies and a lot of resources? And what every single one of us can do, which costs nothing, is to pass on whatever language, additional language, other language we speak to our children.
Mm-hmm.
This is for the parents. For everybody else, we still can do things. I mean, to start with, what we can do about minoritized and endangered languages is to normalize them, bring them to the public fore, encourage speakers to use them. Instead of accepting speakers' apology for speaking a non-majority tongue, imagine you are in some sort of social gathering and some minority speakers, the moment you approach them, they switch into English. You can just say, no, please go on, speak your language. We should encourage people to use their languages more publicly, more openly, even if it means that we as majority speakers may feel moments of isolation. This would be good for us. We need to share their burden of isolation. That would make us much more aware, and it would actually make us feel the way they feel most of the times. So if you're a monolingual speaker of a majority language, make bilinguals feel more comfortable and seen, and put yourself in their position, okay?
Yeah.
Also, we should all try to become very aware of our language biases and how we use language to categorize speakers. It is not okay that you celebrate, let's say, Romeika. And I'm in a very fortunate position that the entire world celebrates Romeika right now because it is an archaic, endangered Greek language. But it's not okay not showing the same excitement for, let's say, heritage Marathi in the UK. Okay, it is not okay to consider Posh to be an English-French bilingual, but not a Punjabi English bilingual. We have so many language biases which have zero scientific basis and which they hurt minoritized speakers. We should try to become aware of this.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean about like Greek institutions and so on. And I think that there'd just be an overwhelming temptation there to treat this as deviant and in need of correction. Just like, oh, that's how quaint. Oh, like how quaint. Now here's the textbook. This is how yeah. And that would just be equally as destructive as just slow extinction or whatever is happening. But yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean about speaking the non-dominant language. It's a funny thing. My daughter and I speak Greek in the U.S. and 99% of the time no one can understand us. I mean, maybe on a college campus someone can. So it's our secret language. Like this is how we say things, and we don't want anybody to hear. And then we go to Greece in the summer, and it's like suddenly we just have to be aware that everyone can understand us. Anyway, right. Good. So here's a question to bring this to an end. So, what are your future plans in studying and researching this language?
I have many plans if I manage to bring them to fruition. I want to continue the language documentation. I love field working. And there's still a lot of work to be done. So I would like to expand the areas in which I carry out field work. So far, I have covered parts of Chaikara and Tonya. I would also like to continue the painstaking historical reconstruction of the Romeyka varieties,
Mm.
which make me read a lot about history and talk to amazing people, including yourself, trying to understand all things that I don't know, but I enjoy this a lot. And ultimately write a monograph about the evolution of Asia Minor Greek.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I can work forward from the few materials you can work backwards from the language that you've studied, the live language that you study, and I don't know, maybe the history will come into focus.
Yeah.
It's such a wild history, Asia Minor, the second, well, the second millennium. It's just really wild. There's so many things going on. So many different speakers of different kinds of Greek, whom you find in the wildest places. Like like Rumi, right? The Sufi poet, and this Persian origin, right? And he's in Southern Asia Minor, and yet he knows Romeika, and he calls it that, and he wrote these poems in it that are it's just wild.
And I find it wild, I've got to say as well. But I have to because I'm actually from this area and I'm very proud to be Pontic Greek. So yeah, I share this excitement and I'm so happy you and others feel this way. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, undoubtedly.
Yeah,
And
on the island, there's some I don't know what they are, dialects, whatever. There's some village idioms on Lesbos, and I was, half my family's from there, so I've always kind of been exposed to it. But when I was in the army there, it was full blast. I mean, there were some kids from the villages there, and it was pretty wild. Anyway, good. Ioanna, thank you so much for coming on and for your work. I will put some links in the podcast description to some of your work, and I look forward to seeing where this goes, and we can continue the conversation. So thank you again.
thank you very much. One of the best things which happened to me last year was actually meeting you and having these fascinating discussions. I so much look forward to more.
That was so unexpected, right? On the part of both of us. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
was like, I
right.
looked at this. I was like, what is this? Why is she using the word this way? And I got to find out more about this. Anyway, okay. So take care, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you again. Bye.